Every year in Genshin Impact is characterized by a few months of extreme hype starting around August or September, which continues into early next year as the Archon quest concludes. Then throughout most of late winter, spring, and early summer, the supposed filler nature of the game's events and versions throughout that time results in nothing of noteworthy import taking place. But on multiple occasions in the past, one of those quote-unquote filler versions would feature a compelling diversion from the main story and/or the inclusion of a high-profile character to drive excitement for a short time. Back in version 2 and 4, we had the arrival of Yelan and Arlecchino, two very strong and appealing units that also coincided with an appealing side story expansion. This time around in 5.7, we're getting someone who, ever since we knew of her, drew a lot of attention and many questions as to what form she would take in-game, considering her otherworldly nature, not unlike Dainsleif. Child's mentor Skirk has made a debut in Genshin, sparking a fair bit of interest in the game that compounds off of the uncharacteristic expansion of Mondstadt the version prior. But unlike Arlecchino and Yelan, who were unanimously appreciated for their strength and versatility, Skirk has a few qualities to her that could potentially impact her reception from a gameplay point of view, and I'll be covering that in this video. The previous character that came out was a Scofier, a sub-DPS cryo character with the ability to not only heal the party but greatly shred enemy hydro and cryo resistance, far beyond what any other singular unit could achieve in the past. Scofier's gold consolidation and power ceiling was so great that she alone elevated Ayaka, Ganyu, and Risley from decent but not all that noteworthy to meta-relevant high tiers once again. Her very inclusion broke an almost 2-year-long ice age affecting the cryo element. Objectively, buffing older characters who struggle in the meta due to circumstance is a good thing, and I'm glad Hoyo's making an effort to keep older generation DPS units in a viable state. However, a potentially huge downside to Scofier's inclusion is that she runs the risk of bottlenecking the cryo element. Her supportive utility, in conjunction with her personal damage, are so high for a single character that future units in that niche will inevitably have to be balanced around that, so as not to upset the balance of the game entirely. Why that poses a problem is because it leads to a catch-22 situation. On one hand, freeze-oriented DPS characters have to be kept at a certain power level so as to avoid getting overbuffed by Scofier and outperforming the competition. It wouldn't be a very good move in terms of optics for the unit in question to beat over Mavuika, the current best DPS in the game, especially if they themselves are not an Archon or high-profile character, and more importantly, so soon after she just came out. Genshin is power creeping as of late, no denying that, but a move like this would feel simply too ostentatious and in bad taste. On the other hand, however, the hypothetical cryo DPS would need to have a considerably low baseline if we accounted for the extra power and comfortability that a Scofier could provide to them, consequently being a unit whose entire usage and pull value is contingent on a specific character. It would be one thing if a unit needs a general support like Verina, Kosaha, or Shilonen to be effective, it's another to need a hyper-specific unit with minimal splashability, let alone possibly two. It would take only one patch for that concern to be proven right. Enter Skirk, our newest DPS unit and a cryo one at that. Now the thumbnail of the video says wasted potential, and I'm sure a number of you were thinking it was in reference to her element. That is certainly a part of it. When the community first laid eyes on her, even among Genshin's colorful cast of unique designs, Skirk was especially attention-grabbing in many ways. Her ethereal, otherworldly, and distorted color scheme bore a striking resemblance to Dainsleif, both of whom looked like they weren't a part of any known region of Teyvat or even channeled one of the 7 elements. The player base was led to believe, if and when they were eventually made playable, that they could potentially introduce an altogether new element given their ties to the Abyss and its unique dark blue-violet aesthetic. You can imagine parts of the fandom couldn't help but feel disappointed at the fact that she would just be yet another cryo character. Granted, she didn't have to represent a new element, but it would have most definitely turned a lot more heads and raised a whole bunch of interesting theories and questions on the future of Genshin Impact's gameplay. Whether we would have gotten a big expansion of possibly multiple new elements the same way Honkai Star Rail introduced a new Remembrance Path and is heavily foreshadowing the release of more later on. In defense of Hoyo, I can see why they prefer to wait until we get like a full version update, similarly to how they held off on Dendro units until version 3. In my video on Genshin needing new elements, I talked about how there would need to be major restructuring of elemental reactions and interactions if they were ever to add an 8th, 9th, 10th element and so on. And I feel like it would have been too much of a hassle and too weird of a time to release a unit with a new element right in the middle of the filler period of a version. Still though, one of the most enigmatic units in Genshin's storyline turning out to be just a cryo DPS kinda leaves you wondering if they missed out on a golden opportunity. That aside, we'll talk about Skirk's gameplay now. Given the fact that her protege Child has 2 differing, practically mutually exclusive playstyles based on what form he's in, his mistress also conducts a dual playstyle. Though she belongs to one of the 7 elements, Skirk is by no means an ordinary character. We'll open up with her elemental burst, Havoc, Ruin. You'll notice immediately that, like Mavuika, Skirk's ultimate does not rely on energy, instead her own Serpent Subtlety resource, making her the second unit in Genshin to have a non-energy based mechanic. although fortunately, unlike Mavuika, you don't have to rely on external sources to power this one up. When you have at least 50, you can activate it for a big blast of damage in an area, and when she's in her special skill mode, she gets a different elemental burst that instead powers her normal attacks for a short time. Functionally speaking, Serpent Subtlety is the same as Night Soul. It behaves as a gas tank for not only activating her ultimate, but powering her entire kit in general, and there are two ways to get it. First is by activating her skill, Havoc Warp, immediately replenishing 45 Subtlety and entering a stance, providing a new set of attacks that deal modified damage. While in this mode, she drains 7 Subtlety per second, meaning her skill alone will give her at least 6 seconds of uptime and change. But she can extend the duration by absorbing Void Rifts that spawn around the field, supplementing her resource bar and augmenting her attacks. We'll talk about Void Rifts in a little bit. Speaking of attacks, you may have taken notice of the fact that Skirk's base scaling is incredible. All of her attacks deal upwards of 2 to 350% in damage, giving you an idea of the kind of numbers we're dealing with. This is definitely in line with the power scaling of 3rd generation units, if not more so. By the way, for those wondering, I consider 3rd generation DPS characters to be post-Novelette. People were asking in my prior videos what I meant by 1st, 2nd, and 3rd gen. It's not a colloquial term, just something I came up with. Anyway, back to her elemental burst. Using it without her skill results in a blast of cryo damage that increases in power for every point of subtlety you have past 50, up to a cap of 12, so 62 points or higher. When done so, Havoc Ruin has a base scaling of 221% times 5 and then 368.3%. But if you have 62 subtlety or more, she adds an additional 417.36% to each instance of damage in her ultimate. Keyword each, meaning all 6 attacks of Havoc Ruin gain that multiplier, pushing her elemental burst damage to a staggering total of almost 4,000%. No two ways about it, she hits like a f***ing truck. But there's a secondary component to her elemental burst. If you cast her skill beforehand, it goes from Havoc Ruin to Havoc Extinction, which doesn't cost any subtlety to use. However, instead of dealing damage, it simply draws in nearby Void Rifts to empower her normal attack damage during this time, up to 20% if you absorb 3. Basically, on one hand you have a giant front-loaded screen nuke that explodes everything all at once, and on the other hand you spread that damage out across the length of her skill for more consistent damage. Both have their places, but that about summarizes the length of Skirk's playstyle. You either use her skill to power up her ultimate for an explosion, or you use her ultimate to power up her skill for consistent DPS. Onto her Ascension passive talents, of which there are 3 to talk about. First and foremost, her unique skill. When all party members are Hydro or Cryo and there's at least one of each, everyone gets 1 more level on their elemental skill. After so long, we finally got someone else besides Child who can raise attack talent levels. Shame it's only on freeze teams though. Now to actually discuss what Void Rifts are. Her A1 passive has this, so when cryo reactions that aren't melt are triggered, a Void Rift is created that chills on the field for a bit, kinda like a source water droplet. When Skirk uses her charged attack, Havoc Extinction, or her whole skill, she absorbs these rifts, each providing 8 subtlety points, and of course if you use Havoc Extinction, it also empowers her normal attack damage. So in total, through skill and day 1 passive, Skirk is able to acquire up to 69 Serpent Subtlety in a given rotation. By this point, you guys might be wondering where the hell are the red flags in her kit, because so far it looks like there's nothing all that wrong with her. Well, it's because the red flag is in her A4. When Hydro or Cryo party members besides Skirk deal damage to enemies, she gains a stack for 20 seconds, up to a maximum of 3. Each party member can only contribute 1 stack, which means every party member has to be either Hydro or Cryo. When done so, Skirk's normal attack damage dealt by her skill and the explosion damage on Havoc Ruin are increased by 110, 120, or 170, and 105, 115, and 160% of the original damage respectively. So when you take this into account, Skirk's normal attack scaling can escalate to well past 4 to 500% per strike, giving her some of the highest raw attack scaling in the game. As well, that aforementioned almost 4,000% elemental burst crosses to well over 6,000%. We've really come a long way since version 1 to say the least. Skirk's elemental burst outclasses a full 30 stack Lightfall Sword burst from Eula by a wide margin, only it's much easier to obtain and no energy cost. This also comes with the implication that Skirk can beat out Ayaka in front-loaded DPS. Point for point, her C0 burst does equal if not more front-loaded damage than Ayaka's C2 burst. In essence, if you have a full freeze team, Skirk shoots out damage like she's the main character of the anime because if the circumstances align, she pretty much is. The downside is what it takes to get to her ceiling. I want to first preface by saying I'm aware every character has a best-in-slot team that performs measurably better than whatever alternative options they have. A common rebuttal I often get is that a DPS character like Novelette greatly enjoys having the ex-Hydro Archon on his team, and would unsurprisingly be worse off without her. That is true, but part of what makes his case a bit different is not only the margin of difference between his best-in-slot and number 2, but also the supposed party versatility of the supports involved. His best team by my estimate consists of Arena, Kosuha, and Shilonen, All 3 of them can be splashed into multiple different engines, meaning there's more incentive than just Novelette to go after these supports. And even if you don't go after them, the minimum value he provides makes him a very high-functioning unit, whereas the more niche DPS like Kanish has a lower value rating by way of his hyper-specific playstyle, making him significantly worse in perception despite being equally as capable. Skirk encounters a similar issue. The nature of her Ascension talents pigeonholes her into a highly restrictive team composition consisting of only Hydro and Cryo. Not the first we've seen in this constraint, as Nilou enjoyed a very successful career in spite of hers. A privilege afforded to the latter, though, is how flexible and accommodating her party needs were. No such luck for the Abyss Girl. To start, early calculations of Skirk's best team as in her best in slot party put her behind only Mavuika in strength. In other words, she convincingly out-DPSs the entire rest of the competition. No small feat in light of the murderer's row of Natlan hyper carries given to us over the past year. Additionally, her party's stringent requirements make finding the rest of her cadre quite difficult, especially for free-to-play players. I will go on record to say Dahlia, who came out alongside her, was blatantly meant to be playing with her and can be quite handy in that department. Skirk's normal attack-centric playstyle entails the potential of benefiting from attack speed augments, of which Dahlia specializes in. However, for him to earn a position as one of Skirk's best-in-slot party members, you'll need to, unsurprisingly, get him up to C6 for a total of 30% attack speed. When accounting for the impressive defensive utility he offers in addition to that, C6 Dahlia can be of greater benefit than 5-star alternatives like support Zalali and Shunhe. Therein lies a critical issue though, the potential cost of a max constellation 4-star. Depending on your luck, or should I say absence of it, pulling 7 copies of a 4-star could be substantially more cost prohibitive than landing a single 5-star, and while it isn't explicitly necessary for you to max Dahlia to have him support Skirk effectively, the fact remains if you're trying to aim for optimal results, he may very well be even more difficult to acquire than a 5-star. That's assuming you have a Scofier. Dahlia is only best in slot, heck, only usable if you have a Scofier, since if you don't, you'll need to find another healing unit to power fanfare stacks. Skirk's projected best party consists of herself, Scofier, Dahlia, and Verena. If you don't have a Scofier though, trying to build a strong team becomes even tougher, since your only options for DPS boosting healers are Mika and Charlotte, who are far from optimal units in their own right. Presumably, Skirk's best team without a Scofier consists of herself, Mika, Farina, and supports Zalali, which, on top of being a serious downgrade from her best, requires you to withdraw Zalali from Mavuika if you were planning to use her for that team. If you don't want to do that, your remaining options are Yelan and Shunhe, both 5-star units, only adding more fuel to the fire of needing hyper-specific units just for this one DPS character. So I don't think anyone wants to pull for her. Putting it bluntly, not having a Scofier will severely hamstring Skirk's party options on account of being limited to only the character pool of 2 elements, not 7, as well as most good options in that pool being units with minimal if any splashability outside of her team, or units who are more needed in another team. Just how worse off is Skirk without the aid of a Scofier though? Broadly speaking, without the head chef, Skirk's DPS goes from being the best in the game if not tied with the best in the game to on the level of current Natlan DPS teams, sans Mavuika, kind of proving my concern back in the Scofier video that Skirk has to be kept intentionally underpowered or completely dependent on a Scofier to not disrupt the metagame too much. We're talking about a 35% difference between a party with and without a Scofier. They're deliberately keeping Skirk from going any higher than she is, all because a Scofier would make her stronger than Mavuika, which Hoyo doesn't really want to do for a non-lore prominent character, even though it's implied that Skirk can easily go toe-to-toe with Archons. That to me is the true wasted potential of the character. Skirk was built up to be one of the most threatening characters in the game in power, shrouded by mystery because of her abyssal origins, and yet in-game she comes out as just another cryo unit with a kit that is strong, don't get me wrong, but under the stipulation that you get all these peripheral units, many of whom can't be used for any other niche besides hers. I wouldn't be so hard on this if a Scofier could be used in other teams, giving her more pull value, but the quote-unquote alternative to Skirk is Ayaka, who's in the same exact role as her, begging the question, why even go for Skirk in the first place? That's not to say she doesn't have options besides a Scofier, but none of them come anywhere close in comparability. Some of you might ask, is this not the best way to manage power creep while still releasing quality characters by making them not all-purpose 1v9ers? It would be if Genshin was a game that lets you have every single unit for free. Unfortunately, since 5-star units cost hundreds of dollars to acquire, not only do you have to go through the trouble of pulling the main DPS in question, but for those who don't already have them, they have to then go out of their way to pull for more characters, of whom you can't extract any value of outside of being used alongside Skirk since any other candidate overlaps in function with her. To build this party from scratch, you have to C6 a brand new 4-star and have already pulled a 5-star support the version prior, just to get her to her strongest point. I understand Genshin doesn't expect you to go that far to complete the game's content, but it's the same as buying a car that can drive 200 kilometers an hour, but you can only drive half that speed unless you pay extra. Then what was the point of buying the car? It doesn't feel good to be gated from a huge portion of a DPS unit's power. Bottom line is, Skirk might be the only character in Genshin for a long time with a power ceiling high enough to contest Mavuika, who totally overshadowed every other unit in the game prior to her arrival. However, it's behind a paywall with quite possibly one of the worst value propositions I've seen in a very long time. I made a big fuss over Mavuika when she first came out for punishing players who didn't pull for Shilonen and Zolali, and it's the same here. If you didn't pull a Scofier, you're locked out of a third of Skirk's maximum strength. To add insult to injury, none of the recent high-profile supports work on her, so for accounts who don't have Mika or Shunhe or Yelan, the former two being units no one has had any pragmatic reason to keep an eye on, and the latter not having gotten a rerun in basically a year, you're out of luck for the time being. To reiterate, none of them are best-in-slot teammates. You have to go through this much trouble for downgrade options. It's no wonder Genshin players have to pay attention to leaks multiple versions into the future. How is anyone supposed to build a party-restrictive unit without knowing months in advance what teammates they'll need? Again, if we could get these characters year-round, that's one thing, but sometimes units don't get featured again for upwards of a year. I don't mind characters of this specific niche, I find them to be quite creative. But if you make them specific and party stringent without giving players enough latitude in dealing with it, it just doesn't feel good to pull for Skirk right now. Anyway, the video is getting very long, so I'll end it off here. For all I know, this can age like milk, and similarly to Mavuika, will get more accessible support for her soon. I honestly hope she does. Let me know your thoughts on Skirk in the comments down below, whether you agree or disagree with my points, but for now, if you enjoyed the video, a like and subscribe would be much appreciated. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and if you haven't yet, feel free to watch my review on the Scofier for more context. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.